Welcome, everybody. I'm really excited to show you some of the highlights of the House Handbook. This was one of the projects that my team and I worked on last fiscal year as we were trying to kind of think about what are all the moving parts that the liaisons are responsible for, and then also kind of thinking about best practices and how you might want to expand your footprint in the work. So today I'm going to give you kind of what I'm calling it the 30,000 foot overview, right, of what all is inside the handbook. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about how we imagined the handbook would be used. So one of the ways that we were thinking about the handbook when we were putting it together was what's the information that a new liaison would want to know? And then what is the information that I'm calling y'all less new liaisons would be interested in knowing or working through. So we'll talk kind of about how to use the handbook in terms of who you are in this process. And then one of the other ways, well, really two of the other ways we were thinking that you could use it. One of them is for training colleagues at your institutions, which is part of your role as a liaison, but then also using the handbook and the information in here to get buy-in from folks above you in administration at your institution. And again, for buy-in, I feel like you all exist, so there is already this level of buy-in. But when we think about resources and locations and those kinds of additional supports, how can you use the handbook to kind of help you build an argument for that kind of support? So those are the content areas we're going to talk about today. So first, for the 30,000 foot view, again, I'm just going to talk a little bit about what's in here and how it's organized. And then we also included 4 exemplars from ICCB institutions that are doing this work. So, and each exemplar has a slightly different piece that they're talking about. So between them, you really do have a complete set of ideas. So we'll just kind of talk about that just a little bit here and then more further down the road a little bit. So when you first open the handbook, you'll see the table of contents. So again, like when we were thinking about the introduction really is mostly about the law and kind of setting the stage there versus definitions, which are the kinds of things we talk about a lot in House 101, let's say, right? But really the content is a mix of required elements, definitions, and then these kind of design tips, plus the peer institution exemplars, and then a piece around legislation that isn't necessarily the House bill that we look at normally, but additional kinds of legislation that are sort of cousins to the initial legislation. So I feel like that's kind of something to just be aware of, and we'll look at that more in a second. In terms of the flow of the handbook, for the most part, we tried to follow the same kind of pattern that we use when we do webinars, so that if you want to use the handbook as a companion piece to the webinars to do training at your institution, it won't be a hard stretch. It also won't require that you create a lot of your own content. You should be able to pretty much use the webinar, the video recordings, or the PowerPoints in conjunction with the handbook. So we tried to kind of be aware of that, and also just in terms of consistency of language. So you're not going to see us say something in a webinar or a slide deck and then something contrary to that in the handbook. So we were really trying to make sure that we're singing the same song everywhere you look. In terms of the design, I just wanted to point to a couple of things that hopefully will make it a little bit easier to read through the handbook. One of the devices that we used are these information boxes. So as you're moving through the handbook, you'll see things in kind of crosswalk grids and highlighted boxes. Things will say things like pro tip and then give you some advice or give you examples of the kinds of things that we're talking about. So we definitely wanted to try to make this thing more readable than just dense pieces of text. You'll also notice that we leave a lot of white space so that you can take notes on the handbook as you move along, if that's something if annotating is something that you do either electronically or using kind of old school paper and pencil. And then I also wanted to just point out that you'll notice a lot of footnotes through here. So we cited a variety of sources that are really good content for you. So definitely take a look at the footnotes. I feel like sometimes in my former life, I was a reading teacher, and I feel like a lot of times footnotes don't get the love that they kind of have earned. So I would say for sure visit the links in there too. They're just legislative language, or they point to other resources and research articles and just other tools for you to do the work. So I think definitely don't sleep on the footnotes. I feel like that's kind of a good piece of advice. And then finally, toward the end of the handbook, you'll see these college spotlights. So city colleges, Waubonsee, Rend Lake, and Moraine Valley were kind enough to share some insights with us about how they go about doing the work. And I'll talk a little bit more about this when we get to the end, but I just kind of wanted to highlight this and to thank the folks at these four institutions for being really generous with their expertise and their time. And again, we thought this would just be a good piece to include, especially as you're thinking about expanding your services or what other kinds of ways you can collaborate with other things going on at your institutions. So in a nutshell, that's kind of the 30,000 foot overview. The way that we really laid that content out, you can see in that table of contents, is thinking about first year liaisons and what do they need, and then beyond the first year liaison and what do they need. So I wanted to do a little waterfall with you all today. So if you're in your first year, then answer this question about this year. If you've been doing this work for more than a year, think back to the first year that you were doing house liaison work. And what was the most challenging aspect of this work? And go ahead and put it into the chat. Don't hit enter just yet. I'll give you about 30 seconds to put something in there, and then we'll group share our ideas. Sarah, I'm going to start with your comment. You had never heard of McKinney-Vento, and I think that was a common experience for first-year liaisons. McKinney-Vento is something that's widely known in homeless services sectors and even in the K-12 system, because the law really points to having a liaison at that level. But for our space, this was really a new thing for us, right? And then Ciara, locating housing resources, Allison, financial resources, yes. And Jenna, really, the need is tremendous, and there are not a lot of resources. That's true. And I think in some parts of the state, there's also some more disparity there, depending on where you're located around the state. So I think that's kind of something. Yep, organizing resources online. We've really tried to identify some good links, but again, especially like for first year people, it can be pretty overwhelming, just the volume of information. Yep. And then Chris trying to figure out who the students are, doing reporting, doing training. Yep. Others are reporting resources. Yeah. And how to even, Calvin, I see how to have intake meetings and what to do around that work. Yeah. Yeah. And then thinking about what are the resources that are out there? How do you connect students to those? There are just a lot of moving parts. Yeah. And Emily, right, that if you don't have dorms connected to your institution, which pretty much we don't, that having to figure out how to connect students to housing resources, whether it's short-term hotel housing or something more longer term, there's not enough out there for the size of the need, that's for sure. Yep. And then Claire, help an administration understand the role, and for sure the time commitment. Yes. Because I feel like initially the law kind of makes it sound like, hey, like the primary thing here is get folks connected to the continuum of care and to financial aid. But when you really start to think about even even if you only had just those two things to do, the moving parts involved in both of those two things are numerous. So yeah, absolutely. Yep, great list, everybody. Thank you for your participation. When we were thinking about the handbook, we were thinking about a lot of those same concerns. And what I would basically argue is if you're in year one as a liaison, that compliance is really the target. Like you just want to make sure that you're compliant with the state statute, right? And really to do that, I would say these other three buckets. Here are the duties, just be clear on what they are. Here are those definitions, like what is McKinney-Vento saying? And then how to look at data. So as some of y'all were saying, like trying to figure out how do you do intakes with people? How do you actually figure out who are the students who are supposed to be serving, right? So again, if this is your first year, then I would say the parts of the handbook that are really going to be the most helpful to you are the introduction, where again, like I said, it's a robust introduction. So it includes a lot of definitions around when we say students who are homeless, when we say students in care, what do we mean by that? Who's the audience that we're looking to? And then this section also includes the list of duties. If you've seen me speak before, you know I enjoy putting these into two different buckets, the bucket of expertise and the bucket of navigation, but you can see they're all represented here. Again, the McKinney-Vento and also continuum of care, what it is and how you find yours. What I was telling folks on Monday's webinar too was do not spend a lot of time trying to figure out which continuum of care is yours and who is your point person. If you can't find it, give me a shout and then I will help figure it out with you, because I don't want you getting already just frustrated by that point, which can also be kind of a lot because there are only 19 continuums and there are 48 of us. So there's some overlap in some ways that are not always super apparent. So other pieces, if this is your first year, thinking about homelessness and the other kinds of concurrent issues that you might see to help you think about who do you want to collaborate with at your institution. And then again, for sure, basics on financial aid and FAFSA simplification are in here. If you're not already housed in financial aid, that's okay. You do not need to become an expert on what FAFSA has to say. But if you can then create a relationship, if you don't already have one, with somebody in financial aid who can be your partner for that piece of the work, that would probably be a great way to kind of approach that element here. Also there's a section here where we talk a little bit about how do you find out which students are the students who are in your target population, and really the way to get students to disclose that information. And then we do also talk about data and reporting. So I would basically say once you get to about the middle of the handbook, it's around page 15 that this all kind of wraps up. If you're in year one, I would stop there and then save the second part of the handbook for year two, because you're going to kind of have your hands full with the first 15 or so pages in here with all of these moving parts. But then for sure come back and revisit the handbook in year two. Don't let it just kind of gather dust electronically or in real life on your shelf. Okay, for those of you who are not in year one, if you're in year two, thinking about what your current vision is for your liaison role, what has changed for you since year one as you move into year two, or for some of you who've been with us for a while, year three, like think about your current year in this role. And now what is the most challenging thing? Hopefully it has shifted a little bit from year one. So again, go ahead and we'll take 30 seconds to put items into the chat, and then I'll have you waterfall them. Yep. So Sarah, getting support from administration, and then again, the persistence of not having resources or agencies to refer students to, right? Ronald, same thing around finding housing and resources. I really feel like that, unfortunately, is going to just be kind of an ongoing challenge in this work, because like I said, we know as a nation we just don't have the resources to scale, and that's true here too. Jenny, trying to balance it with your other duties, yes. Again, I think when this law first came out, most institutions were thinking like, okay, like if this is really about connecting students to financial aid and figuring out their continuum of care contact, and that's kind of where we leave things, you know. But yeah, the work is much larger than that, so for sure. And Calvin, right? How do you, now that you're in year two, like you've kind of have the compliance piece figured out, but now you're really thinking more about like program frameworks and how you design more effective outreach and right. Emily, funding continues to be an issue. Yes. And I think most colleges do have emergency grants, but I agree, like emergency grants are kind of only going to go so far. Yep, financial resources. Yes, and then the Allison, I see the discrepancy between homeless as a definition and how we kind of look at McKinney, how FAFSA looks at it, and yeah, yes, and I think too, thinking about the definitions colleges use to establish residency in district has become another way that we're a little bit getting in our own way with this work, I think. Claire, thinking about how data is collected. Yep. And then when working with the continuum of care and getting local support. Yeah, the time to do the work, I think, is going to be an ongoing piece. Yes, definitely what Jenny said. Yep, finances and budget. Yeah, absolutely. Are any of you partnering with folks over in Perkins World? I feel like we've talked briefly before about how in the right in the Perkins grant, students experiencing homelessness and students in care are considered special populations. So there may be ways for you to kind of leverage some funding there. I mean, again, like there are conditions associated with all of that, but if you haven't already figured out who's your Carl Perkins grant manager, that would be a conversation worth having. Good, I can see some of you have done that. Good, good. Yeah. Well, and for sure, as we were considering, the building this handbook, trying to think about when you move past that first year, thinking really about program design and how folks connect. Claire, I see you. I'll talk to you offline about that, about Perkins stuff. Or actually, let's do this. If you have time at the end of this webinar, Claire and other folks who have not yet connected to Perkins folks, stay on the webinar and we'll just chat briefly about what that is and kind of how pieces work. And then you can always have your Perkins folks call me too. That's fine. Okay, so if this is not your first year, the way we kind of framed out the second half of the handbook was basically around what are the frameworks you can use when you're building out your program, and then I'm a fanatic about the opt-in versus opt-out. So there are these three frameworks, and then there are different service delivery models, including things like high touch, low touch. For those of you who are experiencing kind of the overwhelmingness of this role, the high touch, low touch can be a way for you to kind of think about, if you're not already doing this, which pieces and parts are things that you personally have to put your hands on, and what are things where you could kind of put it out there as more of a self-service menu or something kind of similar. So this to say, the three frameworks we put out are the ones you've heard us talk about in prior webinars. And there are also 2 webinars coming up in November that talk about the frameworks and also the service delivery models. So if you're in years 2 and beyond and you're interested, or even if you're in year 1 and you're feeling like you're interested in additional information at this point, these 3 frameworks, trauma-informed programs, ethics of care, and compassionate assistance are the ones that we talk about. So trauma-informed programs really work to build safety, trust, transparency, student voice, like all of those things we know are really positive about student-centered programming, and then really developing programmings around those kinds of values. Ethics of care kind of, to me, is a good partner to trauma-informed programs, because I feel like ethic of care really tries to continue to put the center of the design as the maintenance of the relationships with students, and also to yourself and to your colleagues who may also be needing a little bit of support in doing the work. So for sure, thinking about that. And then finally, compassionate assistance is really continuing to think through, like, what is the language that we use, and what does it mean to say things like students experiencing homelessness versus homeless students, right? So all of those pieces will be things that we get more into the weeds in this part of the handbook, and then also in the upcoming webinar. Again, in the handbook, we're going to talk about high touch versus low touch. I feel like some things like mental health counseling, that just needs to be high touch. But other kinds of processes can be low touch. So the way that you roll out information to students can be low touch if you find ways to partner with folks. So to me, like a good low touch item can be if you get faculty to include a blurb in their syllabus that talks about who you are, what you do, how folks can access those resources. That is a way where you can make sure everybody's getting information, but you personally, all you really are doing is writing the blurb one time that'll go into all of the syllabuses. So thinking about those kinds of ways to get a lot of information out to students without you personally having to do that with every student is kind of where high touch, low touch is kind of a wizard. And then same with opt-in, opt-out. I feel like we do a lot of opt-in in our environments, which again, to me, becomes then high touch. So if a student has to notify you that they are interested in services versus if you send an email that can go to all students. We talked last year about nudging and thinking about points in your calendar where sending these kinds of messages to everybody can help get the information to the students you're trying to target. And then opting out is just if students aren't interested in what you're offering, they just don't use it. They'll self opt out. So those will be, again, they're highlighted in the handbook, and we also have a really great webinar for you in November about this topic. So if you're interested in hearing more about this, for sure, check out the handbook, but also check out our upcoming webinar. And then also in the handbook for year 2 and beyond, this idea of maximizing cross-college collaborations. So whether that's thinking about, okay, you're doing training, what else could you do? Maybe you do include trauma-informed care training, but maybe you personally don't do it, but there may be somebody else at your institution who can do that for you. Similarly, other kinds of professional development may already be happening at your institution, or how can you kind of lean in to those resources to help you have a lighter lift when you're doing your own training. So that piece is in there for you. And then finally, also this idea around related legislation, which I'll talk more about when we get further down the road, but just kind of helping you to see the larger picture out there in terms of how this piece of legislation connects to other legislation currently in the state or also nationally. I know some of you are sitting there thinking like, you may not really have the bandwidth for that, but that's okay. It's in the handbook. If you're interested, it's there for you. And so here's one of the other ways we imagine you could use this handbook is for training, right? So if you are going to be doing training at your institution, I'm calling it training with webinar support. So let's talk a little bit first about what are the types of things that you've already tried as far as training college employees about the House Liaison role and what it is that you're trying to do with students. So again, we'll do a waterfall, put your things that you've already done for training into the chat, and I'll give you 30 seconds to put stuff in there before you hit enter. Yeah. I feel like Ronald probably has a simple way to get this done, right? If you just invite other people to the webinars that ICSPS is already doing, like that, that'll check the box. That's a good job. Sarah, same thing, right? Like financial aid and care teams, you sent them some information about the act and some summaries from the things that you've learned. Oh, good. And you sent them the handbook. Excellent. Um, yeah, and Chris, I think it is okay to the act doesn't specify what they mean by training. So it doesn't say like you have to do a webinar series of 4 things or you know what I mean? Like I think you could send an email that says like I want everybody to be aware, here's this law, here's what I'm required to do by statute, here are the resources that we have, you know, or even less is more, you know, I'm all about the plain language. So anything you can do to kind of refer people to additional resources or the point of the training is so that the folks at the institution are able to help identify students who could use the resource and then get them to you as the resource. So whatever you can roll out to folks that'll help them get identify students and get them to you is kind of the point. So yeah. Oh, Jenny, I see you, right? Attending department meetings. Yep, that's great. And hosting a all college online training. Allison's doing small groups. That's great. Claire, yes, presenting it at professional development days. So if you know your institution already has these days set aside for training, definitely joining an effort that already exists, a structure that already exists is great. And I think also, right, Claire, this idea you have about like connecting to folks like the TRIO office, anyone who's going to have kind of a similar mission to what you're doing here, I think is really smart. Yep. And the folks at Schoolhouse, yes, are really great. Yeah. Calvin presentations for faculty training days, a flyer campaign on campus. Yes, that's great. And we're actually also right now in the process of creating kind of one-page infographics about what this is about. So once we have those ready for you, then you can send those also. I think that'll also kind of help as a simple one-pager about what this is that we're doing. Emily, you did PowerPoint training. Yeah. Yep, that's great. And then all the resources that we have out there, if you share those with folks too, that's really great. And thinking too about how that information then translates to what you can give to students. Absolutely. Sierra doing, oh, table presentations, great. Yep. Oh, Allison, you're doing something in Padlet. Oh, do share that with us once you get that together. Oh, Claire, that's really interesting. So doing something with the foundation to connect to a local hotel to do a line of credit at the hotel for students. Yeah, that's amazing. Nice. Yes. Yeah, these are all really great ways to get information out to folks. Again, if you're interested in the way the handbook is kind of aligned to that end, for sure, the House Liaison 101 sessions, either from spring 23 or 24 or fall of 24, that was just on Monday this week, covers all of these nuts and bolts, right? Duties, definitions, financial aid, continuum of care, all of this stuff. There was also another webinar that we did back in the spring of 23 that talked about helping to identify students on your campus who may be homeless. And that piece talks about how you get students to self-disclose. It also, again, talks about the frameworks and the service delivery models that we're going to be looking at, again, in greater detail this November. And then plain language, and also like how to use plain language, and then also what some web examples look like for folks who've actually used plain language and are doing this kind of basic needs support work. So this to say, we really tried to keep in mind what we'd already done as webinars and then make the different pieces kind of match up in the handbook so that it's not so much running around and figuring out on your end. So this to say, if you're interested in kind of connecting the webinars and the PowerPoints that we've already done that are already on the House website, this is kind of the template for how everything aligns. Okay, so now it's time to have chatting around getting buy-in. And really, I'll talk a little bit about what are the sections in the handbook where I think, again, in the second half of the handbook, you can start to use these pieces if you need to kind of secure more buy-in from administration at your institution. And then I'm going to talk about the pieces of legislation and how we see them connecting, and then seeing also the exemplars from other institutions. Oh, Claire, I see you just have put in a note about one of your professors does a speech topic related to basic needs and to interview folks on campus. That's great. Any partnerships you can do with faculty have so much contact with students, really finding ways to help them help you, I think, is critical to the success of this mission for sure. Okay, so one more waterfall for today. I believe this is, I'm checking to make sure I don't have any more waterfalls. So what kinds of things have you already tried at your institution to get buy-in for what you're doing? And again, take 30 seconds and put things in the chat. Yep. So Ronald's been doing meetings, reaching out to other departments. Yes, I really think cross-college collaboration is going to be, although time-consuming on the front end, I think it's going to help lighten the load in the long run. So for sure that, and then collaborating with other outside agencies. And here again, thinking about who are the folks at your institution who already have relationships with those outside agencies so that you're not doing a bunch of cold calls, but ideally somebody's being able to give you kind of a warm handoff to a contact that they already have in the agency in that community. Calvin, you created a committee. Nice. Oh, and then you do quarterly reports to the VP of Student Affairs. That's really smart thinking. I feel like the data and reporting that you're required to do to the state is a piece of this, but in terms of moving the needle on this idea about buy-in, I think that the way you're approaching it is savvy to think about like how many students did we serve, what kinds of signs are we seeing that the efforts are impacting student success, student retention, right? Overall well-being. So I think for sure, like thinking about how the reporting that you're doing isn't just static numbers, but to think about like the stories behind the numbers. Oh, Emily, you got Bind to become a coordinated entry site with your continuum of care. That's great. I think there are a handful of colleges that are doing that now. If you have the time to add this to your duties, then I think that really streamlines pieces of this process, right? Because now you can actually do the COC intake instead of having to hand the student off to somebody. Yeah, that's really great. Yeah. Yeah, agreed. I appreciate that you had to meet with the legal team. Yeah. Jenny, I appreciate you taking the charge out there and really advocating for a full-time position for the house liaison and matching that with the benefits navigator, the benefits coordinator position, I think is a smart way to do it. Since we know colleges are already need to have a benefits navigator and yes, I also think patience is going to be kind of key here, right? Like most of us, even with the most well-intentioned administrations, the speed at which we get things done in higher ed is not always at a lightning quick pace. So I think for the most part, like stay in the fight. Um, yeah, they're hiring, but it is going to be slow going, sure. Yep, good. Those are great ways and things that you've done to get buy-in. I think you're making, it looks to me like you're making good inroads. I hope it feels to you like you're making good inroads. So back to the handbook. So again, as you get toward, I would say, the back end of the handbook is where a lot of the buy-in pieces really are, but it usually helps to tap a few of these earlier parts of the handbook. So thinking about how to talk about what are the duties of the liaisons, the ways that your institution can already relieve some of the stressors of homelessness. Of the three frameworks, which is the framework you kind of see fitting best with your organizational culture? Same thing for service delivery. Do you think opt-in, opt-out is something that could kind of mesh with your organizational culture? Or does it really need to think more high touch, low touch? You know, which of these pieces, again, fit with your organization's existing culture? I think trying to I find sometimes if you try to identify the strategies that match your existing environment the best, I think you'll get the most forward gear on that. Sometimes I think I always like to pick the thing that doesn't seem to match the organizational culture, and it's just harder to get things done. So I think if you can look at the frameworks and the pieces earlier in the handbook and think, yes, this would totally resonate here, then that's the way to kind of push buy-in, I think. And as many of you already indicated, this idea of doing cross-college collaborations, figuring out who can you work with the faculty, who do you work with financial aid or with the wellness center, with counseling, advising, how do you kind of navigate that stream, I think is going to be really important. And then finally, there is a section in the handbook that talks about cross-college collaborations. Again, so look in there for other additional ideas to the ones that you've already thought about. And then the college spotlights and the related legislation, I think, are also going to be really helpful for you. So as I mentioned earlier, we had four of the colleges that we asked to talk about the work that they're doing with the House Liaisons and to give us kind of like what they see as one of their most impactful practices. So you can see we talked to city colleges, Waubonsee, Rend Lake, and Moraine Valley. And one of the things I think this is usually exemplars can be helpful with is not every institution always wants to be the first one into the chute of some new thing. So if you are at that kind of organization, great, then I think your angle is like, we can be the first to do this tweak on this idea. However, if you're at an institution where being the first is maybe too much risk, then I feel like these exemplars can kind of help you because you can say, hey, here's something they're already doing at Rend Lake. What if we adopt something similar at our institution? So I feel like these exemplars can really kind of help you to blaze your particular trail. City colleges is definitely unique because they're kind of a system unto themselves, right, with their 7 institutions, but they have wellness centers that they use to kind of connect all of these moving parts. So we talk a little bit about that in this piece. They also have a food market, which is like their version of a pantry, but it also includes fresh produce as well as those kind of shelf stable items. And then they also bring folks on campus to help students get connected to those community resources. So here again, it's not so much you doing a handoff for every student, but you're contacting the community organization and inviting them to a resource fair, and then getting your student list of folks to come to the fair, meet folks, and kind of do that intake process there. And then again, working with those existing resources around SNAP, Medicaid, public benefits, all of those kinds of service coordination pieces. So I think all of those things are really interesting. The other thing that they're doing is they're working with an organization called DePaul USA that sets aside beds for City College students. And they're hoping to kind of scale that as a way to provide more shelter opportunities for the students that they're serving through their house liaison. So I thought was a really interesting project and just some really good ways of how they're pulling all of the threads together. Waubonsee, for those of you who've heard Mary Greenwood talk before, we're talking with Mary, so hopefully she'll come and do some webinars for us about this idea in the springtime. And this idea is about codifying your work through standard operating procedures guides. So by having some kind of standard SOP document, you can get the college to understand all of the moving parts, but also their role in each of the moving parts. And it also ensures that, like, when we are defining this population, here's our institutional definition that we're applying. And then thinking about all the work that needs to get done for this, which departments are kind of taking the lead on that piece of the initiative. So there's still the house liaison over it who's coordinating the moving parts, but getting that buy-in from those other departments by calling them out explicitly in the SOP. And I think is helpful. It also is not Mary sitting in a room by herself writing the SOPs, but she has a committee that she works with, and their mission is basically to implement the legislation. So this to say, I thought it was really great to think about, like, this project needs to live on beyond all of us. So to do that through codifying that language, I thought was a really great way to do it. One of the pieces that she talked about that I also thought was great was they have an intake form, and the intake form questions, those answers go into very specific boxes inside of Banner, their student data system, so that there's consistent data collection. And that's one of the things that they codify in the SOP. So this to say, I thought that was really smart. Rend Lake also thought about this idea about how are we going to make this not just a single human being as house liaison doing all this stuff, but how is this really like an initiative that wraps the whole college in? So they developed the you can see it here, it's CARES Consultation, Advisement, Resources, Exploration, and Success Team. And it's a multidisciplinary group, and together they get the work done. So they do all different kinds of outreach. They do a monthly lunch with students, and they can bring in speakers to that lunch. So students aren't just getting a meal, but also getting information that they need and getting connected to the support services. So I thought that was a really great idea. They also do a food pantry, a laptop loan program, all kinds of resources for mental health and public benefits. And they also have identified some quiet spaces on campus for their students who just need kind of a little bit of respite. So I thought all of that was really fantastic. They also have figured out a way to connect the food cards that students can use in the cafeteria to their financial aid so that students can get meals. So like all of those kinds of ideas are really percolating at Rend Lake. So I thought that was a great example. And then finally over here at the end is Moraine Valley Community College. And again, they've created this program called Project Care that's become sort of a one-stop center for students who need different kinds of resources. So all the same kinds of things that we had talked about before is like around, especially food insecurity, I think, is how often you can get some traction on these different kinds of ideas. So that was definitely the case here, where this where Project Care started out kind of as a food pantry project, and then over time became what it is today. And again, one of the things I think is most interesting here is one of the ways they create ownership there is that they encourage everybody on campus to donate to the pantry or to fund Project Cares by doing payroll deductions. So I think that's a great exemplar for how to get more people to contribute to the whole. So this to say, each of these organizations, thank you all for being willing to kind of bear your projects for the greater good. But really all of these kind of unique takes, everybody, you can kind of see the flavors and the organizational culture kind of coming through. But I thought this would be something to definitely consider in and for sure like year 2 and beyond. So these are in the handbook. And then the last piece I just wanted to point to for buy-in, but also for the handbook, is there's a piece toward the back of the handbook that talks about the legislation that's sort of kindred spirit. So you can see here there's a crosswalk that basically has what we're required to do under as house liaisons under the law. And then over to the right, it talks more about related laws that may be kind of working to similar ends. And I think one of the pieces that I'm always most surprised by is how the Farm Bill is the bill that really authorizes the budgets for SNAP and WIC, and also the language around who qualifies for SNAP and WIC. So I think that's always one of the pieces to just keep an eye on as the Farm Bill is moving through the approval process. And then also in Illinois, there is the Hunger Free Campus Act, which exists but is not yet funded. So one of the things that you might be interested in doing if you don't already have a food pantry, or even if you have a food pantry, but to see if you're kind of in alignment with what the Hunger Free Campus folks would want you to have in order to be funded, it may just be worth taking a look at this piece of legislation. Again, it's unfunded currently, but it doesn't mean it will always be unfunded. So just something to kind of look at. But I just think it's kind of interesting to think about how the Higher Education Housing and Opportunity Act, which created House Liaisons, is connected to some of these other laws, that you just may not always be aware of. So, and then one final shameless plug for our upcoming webinars. So we're going to do a session on the program frameworks. So again, trauma-informed practice, ethic of care, and compassionate assistance. And that'll be Wednesday, November 6th at 1 p.m. with my fabulous colleague, Lynn Mackey will be doing that. And then she will also be doing this next one, the house service delivery models. So again, that's all about like opt-in and opt-out, high touch, low touch. And that'll be Tuesday, November 12th at 10 a.m. If those are of interest to you, make sure that you register using the link on the ICSPS House Center website, which is down here, or also on the flyer that hopefully you received in your emails. So that is all I have for you today. Hang on if you want to talk a little bit about Perkins. And otherwise, what questions do you have for me about the handbook, the sections, the design? Great. Thanks, Ronald. Thank you for coming and thanks for sharing. Thank you all for sharing. Y'all were killing it in the waterfalls today. Thank you for that.